Imagine waking up to a notification on your phone. A name you haven't seen in 6 months, maybe a year, flashes on the screen. It's the avoidant who vanished from your life, leaving you with a mountain of unanswered questions and a hollow chest. Your heart drops. Your mind races. But what if I told you that this exact moment was entirely predictable? What if I told you that their return isn't a random twist of fate, but the final, inevitable mechanical phase of a deeply ingrained psychological loop? Most people think that when an avoidant goes silent, they've moved on, forgotten you, or completely won the emotional game. That is a massive illusion. Silence isn't victory. It's an active, high-energy suppression tactic. But human psychology operates like a pressure cooker. You can clamp down on the steam for weeks, months, or even years, but the laws of emotional physics cannot be cheated. Eventually, the pressure peaks. And when an avoidant finally breaks that silence to face you, a very specific, almost mechanical set of behavioral shifts occurs. Every single time. This isn't about guesswork. This is about reading the unspoken blueprint of human behavior. When they step back into your orbit, they aren't coming back the way they left. They are entering a hyper-vigilant state of high internal conflict, masking it behind an armor of casual indifference or sudden, overwhelming intensity. If you don't know exactly what you're looking at, you will fall right back into the old cycle. You will misinterpret their micro-expressions, buy into their verbal deflections, and misread their physiological baseline. In this breakdown, we are going to dissect the hidden architecture of the avoidance return. We will strip away the confusion and look at the raw behavioral metrics of what happens the moment they face you after a long silence. You will discover the exact physical cues that betray their internal panic, the predictable conversational traps they set to protect their ego, and the specific tests they are running on you within the first 90 seconds of contact. If you have ever been left in the dark by someone who pulled away, you cannot afford to skip a single second of this. By the end of this analysis, you will not only understand what is happening inside their mind, but you will also hold the psychological playbook to read their true intentions clear as day. Intentions they don't even realize they are broadcasting. Let's look at the data. The human nervous system is an incredibly poor liar. When someone with an avoidant attachment style cuts off contact and retreats into prolonged silence, the outside world sees a wall of stone. It looks like indifference. It looks like total, unbothered detachment. But if we look at the behavioral data, that stone wall is actually a massive, energy-consuming defense grid. It takes an immense amount of cognitive load to actively suppress the natural human drive for connection. They are running an internal marathon just to stay still. But eventually, the suppression grid fails. The psychological pressure builds up to a tipping point where the discomfort of the isolation outweighs the fear of vulnerability. That is the exact moment they decide to break the silence. And when they finally stand across from you, or dial your number, or sit down to face you after months of absolute void, a highly predictable mechanical sequence of events triggers. It happens every single time, because human software reacts the same way when its primary defense mechanism is compromised. When they first make contact, they will almost always act as though they only stepped out of the room for 5 minutes. They might send a casual text, ask a mundane question, or bring up a neutral topic. Physically, when you see them, they will try to project absolute comfort. They might lean back, use open gestures, or speak in a slow, deliberate cadence. But look closer. Look at the peripheral metrics. Watch their hands. Are they gripping their phone tighter than necessary? Watch their blinking rate when a person is simulating calm while experiencing high internal stress. Their blink rate will often spike dramatically the moment a sensitive topic is neared, or drop to a rigid, unnatural stare. Watch the microtensions around the mouth and the base of the neck. They are attempting to project a baseline of, "I am completely fine," but the physiological noise is deafening. They are hypervigilant, scanning your face, your posture, and your tone to see if you are going to launch an emotional attack. This brings us to the second phase that happens every single time, the 90-second test. Within the first 90 seconds of interaction, they are running a diagnostic script on you. They will drop a subtle verbal probe, a casual joke, a light comment about the past, or a completely neutral inquiry about your life. This is not small talk. This is an operational test designed to read your emotional temperature. They are looking to see if you are angry, if you are desperate, or if you are completely broken. If you react with immediate emotional intensity, whether it's explosive anger or overwhelming relief, you give them exactly what they need to justify their original departure. You confirm their core belief. See? Connection is chaotic. Connection is a trap. I was right to run away. They will immediately begin to back down the tunnel of their defense mechanism. But if you remain entirely neutral, if you match their casual tone with an unshakable, calm, grounded presence, something fascinating happens. Their psychological map shatters. They expected a storm, and they met a mirror. When you do not feed their need for a defensive reaction, the third phase triggers, the pivot to minimization. To avoid the agonizing discomfort of shame and accountability, the avoidant must protect their ego. They will try to build a clean slate narrative. They will say things like, "I just needed some space," or "Things got crazy busy," or "Why are we focusing on the past?" They are attempting to minimize a 6-month emotional desert into a minor logistical delay. If you watch their eyes during this pivot, you will often catch micro-expressions of intense discomfort, quick flashes of contempt or fear, lasting less than a fraction of a second, appearing right when the concept of accountability is introduced. Their vocal pitch might rise slightly, a subconscious byproduct of the vocal cords tightening under sudden emotional stress. Here is the bottom line. When an avoidant finally faces you after a long silence, they are not coming back because they have magically healed or because they suddenly became transparent. They are coming back because the illusion of their independence finally cracked under the weight of human reality. They are presenting you with a carefully manufactured version of themselves to see if it's safe to dip their toes back into the water. They want to see if you will play the old game by the old rules. They want to see if you will chase them, demand answers they aren't ready to give, or completely fold just to have them back. But the moment you understand the mechanics of their behavior, the moment you recognize the synthetic calm, decode the 90-second test, and see through the minimization, the power dynamic completely flips. You are no longer a victim of their silence. You become the observer of their patterns. And when they realize that their armor no longer works on you, the facade drops. The real human being behind the avoidant mask is forced to show up. And for the first time in the entire relationship, you get to dictate exactly what happens next. When they first make contact, they will almost always act as though they only stepped out of the room for 5 minutes. They might send a casual text, ask a mundane question, or bring up a neutral topic. Physically, when you see them, they will try to project absolute comfort. They might lean back, use open gestures, or speak in a slow, deliberate cadence. But look closer. Look at the peripheral metrics. Watch their hands. Are they gripping their phone tighter than necessary? Watch their blinking rate. When a person is simulating calm while experiencing high internal stress, their blink rate will often spike dramatically the moment a sensitive topic is neared, or drop to a rigid, unnatural stare. Watch the microtensions around the mouth and the base of the neck. They are attempting to project a baseline of, "I am completely fine," but the physiological noise is deafening. They are hyper-vigilant, scanning your face, your posture, and your tone to see if you are going to launch an emotional attack. This brings us to the second phase that happens every single time, the 90-second test. Within the first 90 seconds of interaction, they are running a diagnostic script on you. They will drop a subtle verbal probe, a casual joke, a light comment about the past, or a completely neutral inquiry about your life. This is not small talk. This is an operational test designed to read your emotional temperature. They are looking to see if you are angry, if you are desperate, or if you are completely broken. If you react with immediate emotional intensity, whether it's explosive anger or overwhelming relief, you give them exactly what they need to justify their original departure. You confirm their core belief. See? Connection is chaotic. Connection is a trap. I was right to run away. They will immediately begin to back down the tunnel of their defense mechanism. But if you remain entirely neutral, if you match their casual tone with an unshakable, calm, grounded presence, something fascinating happens. Their psychological map shatters. They expected a storm, and they met a mirror. When you do not feed their need for a defensive reaction, the third phase triggers. The pivot to minimization. To avoid the agonizing discomfort of shame and accountability, the avoidant must protect their ego. They will try to build a clean slate narrative. They will say things like, I just needed some space, or things got crazy busy, or why are we focusing on the past? They are attempting to minimize a 6-month emotional desert into a minor logistical delay. If you watch their eyes during this pivot, you will often catch micro-expressions of intense discomfort, quick flashes of contempt or fear, lasting less than a fraction of a second, appearing right when the concept of accountability is introduced. Their vocal pitch might rise slightly, a subconscious byproduct of the vocal cords tightening under sudden emotional stress. Here is the bottom line. When an avoidant finally faces you after a long silence, they are not coming back because they have magically healed or because they suddenly became transparent. They are coming back because the illusion of their independence finally cracked under the weight of human reality. They are presenting you with a carefully manufactured version of themselves to see if it's safe to dip their toes back into the water. They want to see if you will play the old game by the old rules. They want to see if you will chase them, demand answers they aren't ready to give, or completely fold just to have them back. But the moment you understand the mechanics of their behavior, the moment you recognize the synthetic calm, decode the 90-second test, and see through the minimization, the power dynamic completely flips. You are no longer a victim of their silence. You become the observer of their patterns. And when they realize that their armor no longer works on you, the facade drops. The real human being behind the avoidant mask is forced to show up. And for the first time in the entire relationship, you get to dictate exactly what happens next. To truly understand what occurs when an avoidant breaks a prolonged silence, we must first dismantle the illusion of their detachment and look directly at the underlying behavioral physics. When a person with an avoidant attachment style retreats into isolation, the conventional narrative suggests they are experiencing a state of peaceful relief or complete emotional erasure. This is a fundamental misreading of human behavior. In reality, the period of silence is an active, high-energy operational phase that requires an immense expenditure of cognitive load. Attachment bonds do not simply vanish because a person refuses to acknowledge them. Instead, the avoidant must deploy a massive internal suppression grid to consciously stifle the natural human drive for connection, intimacy, and belonging. They are essentially holding their breath underwater, forcing a state of artificial independence while their internal system screams for air. This psychological suppression operates exactly like a pressure cooker, where emotional data is clamped down and denied an exit. For weeks, months, or even years, the avoidant relies on distractions, workaholism, hyper-independence, or superficial interactions to maintain this lid. However, the human nervous system cannot tolerate a perpetual state of high-alert suppression without eventually fatiguing. Over time, the energy required to maintain the wall of indifference depletes, while the internal pressure of unexpressed emotion, uncalculated grief, and hidden longing steadily mounts toward a critical mass. The tipping point occurs when the sheer psychological discomfort of maintaining the isolation finally eclipses the deeply ingrained fear of vulnerability. When this threshold is crossed, the avoidant is forced to make contact, not necessarily because they have resolved their core wounds, but because their primary defense mechanism has completely run out of fuel. This brings us directly to the moment of re-entry, where we observe the phenomenon known as the baseline shift. Because their internal system is under extreme turbulence from the collapse of their defense grid, the avoidant cannot simply reappear with a genuine grounded presence. Instead, they must rapidly manufacture a synthetic baseline to mask the chaos. When they finally stand before you or send that initial message, they will attempt to project an aura of absolute, unbothered composure. They simulate a baseline of ordinary day-to-day normalcy, often acting as if the catastrophic rift in communication never took place or was merely a minor logistical pause. This synthetic calmness is an intentional behavioral shield designed to control the narrative of the interaction before it even begins. If you look purely at their macro behaviors, their casual posture, their slow vocal cadence, or their choice of neutral conversational topics, you might be fooled into believing they are completely fine and entirely in control. But a behavioral profiler looks at the leakage, because the transition from total suppression to sudden exposure is incredibly jarring to the nervous system. The avoidance baseline is profoundly unstable during the initial moments of the confrontation. The energy that was previously used to maintain the silence has now been redirected into hypervigilance. They are intensely scanning your facial topography, decoding your vocal frequencies, and monitoring your physical proximity, terrified that you will pierce their armor or demand immediate emotional accountability. This hidden panic causes an overregulation of their body language, resulting in tells such as a rigid spinal alignment, an unnaturally fixed gaze, alternating with rapid microblinks, and brief, frozen moments in their hand gestures. They are presenting a highly stylized, tightly scripted version of themselves because their actual emotional baseline is in complete disarray, caught between the instinct to flee and the desperate need to find a safe harbor after months in the void. The moment the avoidant breaks the silence and steps back into your physical or digital space, the clock starts ticking on an incredibly precise, high-stakes behavioral window known as the 90-second test. Within this initial minute and a half of contact, the avoidant is not merely catching up or exchanging pleasantries. They are executing a highly calculated diagnostic script designed to map your current psychological state. This test is completely subconscious but entirely systematic, born out of a desperate need for self-preservation. Because their entire identity is built upon avoiding emotional engulfment and maintaining a rigid illusion of control, they must immediately determine if you represent a threat to their autonomy. They are terrified of encountering a wall of explosive anger, a flood of desperate tears, or an immediate demand for deep emotional accountability, all of which would instantly overload their fragile coping mechanisms. To mitigate this risk, they drop specific, low-stakes verbal probes, such as a casual joke about a shared memory, a completely mundane question about your work, or a lighthearted observation about the weather, and then step back to analyze your response. These probes act exactly like sonar pings sent into the dark to calculate the shape and temperature of the terrain ahead. They are measuring your emotional baseline to see if you have spent the period of silence stewing in resentment, or if you are so broken by their absence that you will immediately fold and chase them. If your reaction to their initial probe is filled with intense emotional charge, whether you explode with justified fury or instantly melt with overwhelming relief, you unwittingly provide the exact data their avoidance software is looking for. You validate their deepest core belief that intimate connection is inherently volatile, unpredictable, and suffocating. The moment you show high emotional reactivity, they check the box on their diagnostic script that says dangerous, and their psychological defense mechanisms will instantly re-engage, causing them to pull back into the safety of the void once again. Conversely, if you react with a completely unshakable, neutral baseline, matching their casual approach with a polite, grounded, yet entirely detached presence. You completely disrupt their internal map. They enter the interaction expecting either a fight or a chase, because those are the only two behavioral scripts their past dynamics have taught them how to navigate. When you offer neither, when your expression remains calm and your tone remains entirely even, you create a profound psychological vacuum. They realize within those 90 seconds that their absence did not destroy you, nor did it leave you waiting on the edge of your seat to attack them. This neutrality strips away their ability to paint you as the chaotic party in the relationship, effectively dismantling their justification for having run away in the first place. By withholding the immediate emotional validation they secretly want, but overtly fear, you force them out of their pre-programmed script and into a state of raw vulnerability. They are suddenly left standing in the open, exposed, without the protective shield of your predictable reaction to lean on. This 90-second window is the precise axis upon which the entire power dynamic of the return revolves, because your refusal to take the bait completely scrambles their behavioral compass, forcing them to either show up genuinely or confront the terrifying reality of their own patterns. Beneath the heavily guarded exterior of the avoidance return lies an entirely separate, involuntary narrative written entirely by their physiology. No matter how meticulously they rehearse their casual introduction, or how masterfully they attempt to project a facade of cool indifference, the human nervous system cannot completely suppress a high-stress internal state. When an avoidant faces you after a long period of silence, their body enters a state of profound autonomic arousal, and this internal friction inevitably leaks out through micro-expressions of vulnerability. These brief, fleeting flashes of genuine emotion last for less than a fifth of a second, appearing on the face before the conscious brain can intervene to mask them. If you know precisely where to look, you can observe the raw data of their underlying anxiety, guilt, and deep fear of rejection, cutting right through their manufactured baseline. One of the most prominent physiological tells to watch for during the initial moments of the confrontation is the presence of micro-smiles or asymmetric smirks that flash across their face when you first make eye contact or when a vulnerable topic is touched upon. In behavioral analysis, this is not a sign of genuine amusement or arrogance. Rather, it is a nervous pacifying response known as a contempt mask or a tension release mechanism, used subconsciously to deflect the agonizing weight of shame. Furthermore, as the conversation progresses, you will notice a high concentration of anchoring behaviors and self-soothing micro-gestures. They might frequently adjust their collar, fiddle with a watch, touch the suprasternal notch at the base of their throat, or repeatedly smooth down their clothing. These are classic non-verbal signals of a system attempting to down-regulate high levels of cortisol and adrenaline. Their brain is actively trying to comfort itself in an environment it perceives as psychologically hazardous. Another critical metric of vulnerability can be found in their vocal acoustics. When a person is experiencing internal emotional suppression, the muscles surrounding the vocal cords contract under stress, leading to subtle, but highly telling vocal pitch shifts. You may notice their voice cracking slightly, rising in frequency when they try to minimize the duration of their absence, or dropping into a forced, gravelly vocal fry as they try to artificially project stability. This auditory noise completely betrays the synthetic calmness they are attempting to broadcast. Additionally, look closely at their ocular metrics, specifically their blink rate and directional eye shifts. The moment the conversational gravity shifts toward accountability or emotional truth, an avoidance blink rate will often spike dramatically, jumping from a normal baseline of 15 blinks per minute to well over 50 blinks per minute as their brain experiences a massive spike in cognitive load. Alternatively, they may exhibit brief micro-aversions of gaze, looking straight down at the floor or sharply to the side for a fraction of a second when asked a direct question about their feelings, which indicates a sudden surge of internal shame and a temporary inability to tolerate the intimacy of sustained eye contact. These involuntary physiological responses serve as an absolute confirmation that the stone-cold, unbothered persona they are presenting is entirely hollow. They are experiencing a massive internal storm, desperately fighting to keep their emotional shield raised, while every single nerve ending in their body is screaming with the terrifying weight of being seen. Once the avoidant realizes that their physical leakage is betraying them, and that their 90-second test has failed to provoke an emotional outburst, they will immediately pivot to their primary linguistic defense mechanism, which is the deployment of the clean slate narrative. This behavioral strategy is an intentional, aggressive attempt to completely rewrite or minimize the timeline of their absence in order to bypass the agonizing discomfort of accountability and shame. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, admitting fault or acknowledging the profound emotional damage caused by their prolonged silence is a psychological impossibility during the initial stages of re-entry. Doing so would completely shatter their fragile ego and force them to confront the terrifying reality that they acted with cruelty or cowardice. To protect their self-image, their brain subconsciously constructs a sanitized version of history where their sudden disappearance was not a deliberate act of abandonment, but merely an unfortunate, unavoidable logistical delay. When they articulate this narrative, they will utilize specific linguistic deflections and minimizing phrases designed to shrink a massive emotional desert into a minor, trivial incident. They will say things like, "Things just got incredibly crazy with work," or "I just needed a few days to clear my head," or "I didn't think it was that big of a deal." By framing their months of absolute silence as a simple case of being busy or needing a little space, they are attempting to set a new rule for the interaction, that the past is entirely irrelevant, and that bringing it up is a sign of your irrationality. If you look closely at their behavioral metrics during this pivot, you will catch distinct microexpressions of intense discomfort and defensiveness flashing across their face the exact moment the concept of time or accountability is introduced. Their upper lip may tighten, their nostrils may flare slightly, and their posture will often become momentarily rigid as they attempt to muscle through the lie. Linguistically, they will also attempt to switch the focus of the conversation by using gaslighting techniques disguised as casual observation, making comments like, "You're reacting like I've been gone for 10 years," or "Why are you always looking backward instead of forward?" This is a highly calculated attempt to make you doubt your own perception of the timeline and to shift the burden of guilt from their abandonment onto your reaction to their abandonment. If you allow them to establish this clean slate narrative without pulling them back to reality, you essentially grant them permission to treat your presence as a revolving door, confirming to their subconscious that they can disappear and reappear whenever their anxiety dictates, without ever having to pay the emotional price of admission. They are trying to sweep the entire wreckage of the silence under the rug with a single casual sweep of their hand, desperately hoping that your desire for connection will cause you to play along with the illusion. This phase of the interaction is a massive psychological power play, masked as casual conversation, where they try to force you to accept a deeply distorted reality just to keep the peace. The entire trajectory of this high-stakes interaction ultimately converges on a single critical pivot point: the operational choice of your reaction. Up until this specific moment, the avoidant has been driving the pace of the encounter, relying on their synthetic baseline, their 90-second test, and their clean slate narrative to maintain tactical control. But the second they finish putting out their diagnostic probes, the leverage completely shifts into your hands. Your behavioral response is the exact variable that determines whether their psychological defense mechanism stays intact or completely disintegrates. If you choose to provide immediate emotional validation, whether that takes the form of tears, overt relief, desperate questioning, or even explosive, highly charged anger, You effectively feed their system the exact data it requires to reset the old behavioral loop. To an avoidant subconscious mind, any high-energy emotional response from you serves as an absolute confirmation that they still possess unfettered emotional access to your psychological real estate. If you display intense relief or immediate forgiveness, you demonstrate that their silence carries zero consequences, giving them a green light to utilize abandonment as a weapon whenever their anxiety peaks in the future. If you react with intense anger, you accidentally validate their internal narrative that intimacy is a chaotic, volatile battleground, allowing them to retreat back into the void with a clean conscience, firmly believing that you are the unstable element in the dynamic. In both instances, by offering an emotional reaction, you allow them to safely keep their armor on, shielding them from the necessity of self-reflection. They leave the interaction having successfully managed their shame, leaving you trapped in the exact same loop of chasing, waiting, and wondering. However, if you execute the alternative operational choice and maintain an unshakable, entirely neutral baseline, you trigger a profound systemic shock within their nervous system. Maintaining neutrality does not mean acting cold, vindictive, or aggressively silent. Rather, it means presenting a completely flat, polite, and unbothered psychological surface. You match their casual remarks with a calm, even vocal cadence, keeping your facial features completely relaxed and your posture entirely grounded. When you anchor yourself in this unshakable baseline, the avoidance brain experiences a massive cognitive error. Their pre-programmed behavioral scripts are entirely dependent on a reactive target. They have spent months preparing to either dodge your anger or evade your desperation. When they encounter neither, when they hit a wall of absolute, unyielding emotional neutrality, their psychological shield begins to rapidly collapse. Without a reactive stimulus from you, the avoidant is left completely exposed to the vacuum they created with their own silence. The lack of emotional feedback forces their brain to turn inward, causing an immediate spike in their internal cognitive load. You will visibly observe the exact mechanics of this defensive collapse through their peripheral behavioral metrics. Their synthetic calm will dissolve into overt signs of distress. Their breathing will shift from deep diaphragmatic patterns to shallow clavicular breaths. Their hands may begin to micro-tremble as they touch their face or neck in an attempt to self-soothe, and their verbal fluency will stutter as they struggle to find words that fit this unmapped territory. By withholding the emotional validation that usually shields them from their own behavior, you force the avoidant to confront the terrifying weight of their own isolation. The manufactured persona drops, the illusion of their complete independence shatters into pieces, and the raw, unhealed, deeply anxious human being hiding behind the avoidant mask is finally forced to show up in the room.